Hello, everybody. So, it's time for my first story. Just a word of caution before I start, this does touch on a thorny political topic, so if you're someone who is easily offended, this probably isn't the story for you. I know I've tried my best not to be provocative and to present my own opinion in a logical, reasonable way, but I do realize that sometimes that's not enough for some people. Well, with disclaimers aside, now it's time for the debate. Ever since my lungs first filled with air, I have been only one thing to the most obstinate members of the medical world. Oh, they won't admit it. They never will because they can't. How could those respected experts admit that for all 17 and a half years of my life I've not been a person to them? Oh, the people at neonatal ICU, my pediatricians, all the doctors who have helped me since that moment, they're good people. And in many ways, it's thanks to them that I'm still here. But if they know the whole story, yet still hold to one pernicious belief, as some of them do, then I'm not a person, a human, a life. No, I'm an impossibility, a miscalculation, a problem, a fact that stands as evidence to the truth they deny. To those people, especially the first who ever saw me, I always was, and always will be, a mistake. The room was crowded, reminding me of all the waiting rooms of all the hospitals I'd ever been in, though admittedly with a much more lively and cheerful atmosphere. The air buzzed with at least 7 different conversations being maintained simultaneously at a volume level just under dull roar. The noise didn't bother me, though. Over the years, I'd developed the ability to tune out most of the surrounding white noise when working on a project. But certain words can filter through my mental guards. I heard it then, and though I didn't move, I shifted my focus from my laptop screen to the conversation behind me. To most around me, the change was imperceptible, but my little sisters, Cecilia and Sierra, picked up on my increasing tension. I glanced at them, saw they were listening to the girls behind me too, but they were more concerned than angry. Of course, they would be. I don't mean that to be accusatory. I'm merely stating fact. They believe as strongly as I do on this issue, but I'm the one who's had first-person experience with the consequences. They could see that I was only a few seconds away from charging into battle, and I could tell they wouldn't stop me. No, they were just pleading with me, begging me to stay calm. I would try, but it would be a struggle. I stood slowly, placing my laptop gently on the table before turning to regard the speakers behind me with an icy calm. There were 6 of them, all girls, ranging in age from 16 to 18 unless I missed my guess. The one talking had her back to me, but appeared to be my age, with bleach blonde hair and trendy clothes. And it's a major setback for women's rights. I mean, come on. No abortions after 20 weeks just because they claim the fetus can feel pain then? That's just wrong. It's turning the clock back. Oh, really? The words were spoken in a quiet voice, but my tone caught their attention, and all 6 of them turned to me. I heard my debate coach's admonition running through my head. Remember, Jessica, the other speaker is not your enemy. You've picked a noble cause, but always remember you are trying to help the other person, not hurt them. You are seeking to combat words and ideas. The words of a death sentence, the ideas that condone this massacre, but you are not attacking another human being. With his words running in my head, I repeated myself, a little louder this time. Oh, really? Would you care to clearly explain just what you mean when you oh so loudly complain that the fetal pain bill just passed by the state Senate is turning the clock back? This was always my first move. Make the other person explain themselves so you know exactly which version you are facing. That way, your rebuttals won't accidentally miss their mark. Blondie seemed taken aback to the point of speechlessness, but one of her older friends, a brunette with a confident bearing, took over the argument. The other conversations gradually faded to silence as all eyes focused on the 2 of us, and I received the distinct impression that I was not the first person to attempt the ensuing duel of words in this room. The new speaker grinned down at me smugly as she stood at least 6 inches taller, and said, "What Shara meant is that any bill limiting a woman's right to determine what she does with her own body is turning the clock back to a time when women had almost no rights." The tone in her voice made it clear that every girl in the room, myself included, ought to automatically agree with her, and every boy who didn't must be out to oppress women. I nodded slowly, making a show of digesting her statement. At last I spoke in a level tone, attempting to keep my voice free of any condescension or anger. "For the most part, I agree with you. In fact, I believe there's only one point on which we disagree." The older girl cocked an eyebrow at this, obviously having expected something else, but she only said, "Do go on." "Well, the fundamental point on which we agree is that every human being, man or woman, has a right to control over his or her own body. I don't dispute that." Again, my fellow debater seemed surprised I would concede such a point, but this time I did not wait for her invitation to continue. "In fact, I believe the disagreement between us does not come down to a question of who has what rights, but a question of definitions, if you will. One definition in particular, but I go too fast." I paused a moment, letting my gaze sweep over the other people in the room, and now I noticed just how interested they were. Like the other girl, they seemed surprised at which direction the discussion had taken, except for Cecilia and Sierra, who'd seen me use this strategy before. I turned back to the discussion. "Do you mind if I ask you some questions?" I trailed off, and she caught my attention. "Candace, and no, I don't mind." Her tone and expression clearly said she found this amusing, but didn't think her arguments were in danger. "Thank you. Now, Candace, humor me for a second while I change the instance, but would you agree that murder is illegal?" Candace blinked, and then her eyes narrowed. "It's not the same thing." "I'm not trying to say that they are at this point. But my question remains. Is it against the law to willingly take the life of a human being?" "Yes," she replied, chin lifted and eyes blazing, prepping her arsenal to refute the point she thought she saw coming next. "So the government tells us it is wrong to willingly and knowingly kill another person. And insofar as murder is interfering with the right to control over one's own body, I feel comfortable in assuming we would both agree with the law, yes?" My tone was level, and just a trifle more formal than conversational as I turned back to her, awaiting her reply. "Yes, as you so rightly said before, we agree that everyone has a right to their own body." I could hear the word "but" coming in her tone, so I quickly moved on. "First rule of cross-examination, yes or no questions only if you can." Her time to talk would come soon enough. "Yes, on that we do agree. In fact, I believe it is safe to say that we would both agree abortion becomes murder once the baby is alive. Yes?" I saw her forthcoming argument and held up a hand. "I'm not saying at what point that is, yet. But wherever it is, an abortion is no longer the mother exercising her own right, but infringing upon her child's, at the point at which the baby is alive." For a second, I saw true anger in her eyes, but it was gone in an instant, and Candace regained her calm demeanor. "Of course, but the point you're missing is, does the ability to feel pain mean that the fetus is in fact a living human baby? You see, that is the point about which we disagree. The definition we contest. It is the definition of life. What both sides of the issue, pro-choice as well as pro-life, are trying to find is a standard. A universal standard we can apply to every situation to determine if the baby is alive. We are looking for a clear line, not in sand, but in stone, on one side of which the fetus is not alive and abortion is permissible, on the other side of which the baby is in fact a living human being, and any attempt to terminate the pregnancy is murder. Would you agree? I'd let a little passion seep into my tone on the last few sentences, but I'd managed to keep it from turning to anger. After all, she was still being reasonable. Perhaps she just never truly thought about the consequences of her belief. Most haven't. I had to stay calm. I knew it would not be shouting and slogans that made my point, but well-reasoned arguments and a calm, logical manner. Candace seemed taken aback, but I stood, waiting, the thought crossing my mind that, I swear, if the next words out of her mouth are some situations are complicated, and I have to go into a debate about the definition of definition, I'll lose most people here, quite possibly my temper. She paused, still thinking, probably testing the logic of my statement. Excuse me, but what exactly are you trying to prove? Huh. An intelligent question for once. Most people didn't ask. They just assumed. Perhaps there was hope for this girl. As I said, we are both looking for such a standard, and I believe I have found one that applies in each and every circumstance. If possible, I should like to convince you of the same. Will you allow me the chance to try? At my return to a level tone of voice, Candace tilted her head to one side, and I felt her gaze boring into me, as if seeking my true motive or hidden weapons. Oh, she had no idea the closing punch I could throw. But perhaps this time, I wouldn't have to. This is all very interesting. I've often wondered how any woman could argue against the right to choose. Perhaps I shall receive a satisfactory answer for once. Please, continue. I took a deep breath, most of my anger being replaced by confidence. Now I was on certain ground. I knew how to work the argument from here. And best of all, I knew every word I was about to say was true, an advantage for any debater on any topic. Now, the thing about the standard for determining life is that it cannot be changeable. It cannot call the exact same person alive and not alive at the same time, because you're either alive or not, right? This time the question was asked of the room in general, and I saw most heads nod in agreement. And one more thing that must be agreed before I can move on. Once you are alive, you remain so until you are dead, yes? No being alive, then not alive, and then alive again? I saw one young man mouth the word zombies to his friend, who sniggered, but other than that I had everyone's attention and their assent. Good. Now, in my experience, there are 3 possible standards most people will attempt to use at one time or another: birth, viability, and time. Now, is there anyone here who thinks a child must be born before it is truly alive? All I got for that question were confused expressions. Time to backtrack. How many here have younger siblings? Roughly half the people in the room raised their hands. Not as many as sometimes, but for the argument's sake, it didn't have to be all of them. How many of you remember your mom inviting you to feel the baby kick? Did a doctor or nurse ever let you listen to the baby's heartbeat? Some people were beginning to look uncomfortable. Either this was a really sensitive and awkward subject, or they were having to examine preconceived notions they'd held for a while without ever questioning. A distinct possibility. What is it about moving roughly a foot that constitutes becoming alive? Is a location change all it takes? Did you know it is now possible to partially deliver a baby, operate on it, then return it to the womb for the remainder of gestation? If being born, emerging into the world beyond the womb, was what it took to be alive, then wouldn't those babies be alive, not alive, then alive again? Some people still looked a little uncomfortable, but others nodded slowly, following my logic. They'd caught this point, at least. And we'd already agreed that that's impossible. So no, I reject birth as the standard for life. I took a deep breath and then continued. Perhaps viability will suffice. It's the popular one nowadays, or at least it used to be. I turned back to Candace. In order to be both fair and clear, would you mind explaining viability briefly? That way you can be sure I'm not providing a skewed or biased definition. Candace gave me an odd look, but she did oblige after the briefest of hesitation. If the fetus can survive outside of the mother's womb, then it is a baby and is considered viable. And to be clear, It is considered viable even if a machine is supporting its life, as in the case of a premature infant. This was a point that had to be made. I'd yet to come across a person who disagreed, especially after I mentioned preemies, but the last thing I needed in a debate like this was to leave ground for an off-the-wall argument. She gave me a sideways glance. Of course. Ah, good. She was not only reasonable, but she had a relatively intact conscience. Even better. I have two problems with this standard of viability. 1. It assumes the baby is alive in the womb. See, people speak of machines sustaining life, but if such is the case, then there must be life to start with. Just because our machines are not as sophisticated as a mother's womb when it comes to keeping the earliest premature infants alive, does that mean they are not alive when in the womb? A quick glance around confirmed my fears, almost absolute confusion and some skepticism. Well, this was the hardest of my arguments to phrase. At least the second one was clearer. Secondly, the standard is not unchanging when applied universally. It varies its answer depending on available technology. Where there is sophisticated equipment, babies born at 4.5 and 5 months along have survived. But at Speedy Health Mart or in a third world country, they wouldn't have a chance. The exact same child would be viable and therefore alive in one place, and non-viable or not alive in another when the only thing that changed was the technology available. See the problem? They did, I could tell. This was the easiest argument to understand, at least by my assessment. That leaves us with the standard of time. That is, a point in gestation after which the child is alive and before which it was not. The one point in the pregnancy that the fetus becomes a baby. Obviously, if we knew what that point was, this would be the most fair and most universal standard of life there is, and we could outlaw all abortions after that point, but permit them before. Yes? Some listening in the crowd began to look suspicious, but most nodded, following my logic. This was where I had to be careful. If I misspoke or misrepresented my position here, someone would take the opportunity and pounce on it. I turned to the blonde girl, Shara, who'd been speaking when I first stood up. Shara, if you wanted an abortion, would you have one? I picked her because the little I'd seen of her personality told me the dialogue I had planned would work with her. She was a regurgitator, one who just spewed back what she'd heard. She didn't think about it like Candace obviously did. Well, now she would have to. She lifted her head defiantly, smirking. I don't think she'd really been listening to the debate at all. Of course! It's my legal right, after all. Not necessarily your ethical right. Aloud, I only said, when? She blinked, confused. What? When would you have that abortion? I could feel Candace's penetrating gaze on my back, still trying to figure me out. Whenever I decide to. From the corner of my eye, I saw Candace roll her eyes at her friend's response. I flashed her a sympathetic glance. I understood Shara was not stereotypical of the pro-choice proponent, but I didn't need average. I needed someone who hadn't thought about it. In other words, most kids my age. The ones who didn't think it mattered. My argument could stand without this dialogue, but a conversation like this never failed to help set my point up. A second before birth. Is he still not alive? Way earlier than that. It's probably alive at that point. 8 months along. Is she alive yet? At this point in the debate, I would stop saying it when referring to the baby. After all, if the child was alive, as I believed, then the baby was either a he or a she, but not an it. Her confidence was waning, replaced by uncertainty. No, yeah, the kid's probably alive that late. I kept at it, pressing her back. When I got her down to 5 months, I stopped. To get to that point, I'd had to bring up the stories of several premature infants as proof the child was alive even as early as that. After all, I'd reminded the crowd of watchers, it can't have been just being born that made those preemies alive. But I got the feeling the dialogue would become more trouble than it was worth in setting up my point after that, so I stopped pushing her, addressing the room as a whole once more. Most abortions don't take place before 7 weeks along. By then, she has a heartbeat. She's had it for over a month. She has her own blood type. Maybe it's even different than her mom's. In a photo, you can clearly pick out arms and legs, hands and feet, sometimes eyelids, toes, fingers, or a nose. There are already brain waves. Perhaps our machines can't sustain his life at that point, but does that mean he's not alive? Most of what changes about the child from week to week during pregnancy are physical developments. He's growing up, much like he will continue to do for 18 or so years after he's born. But life is not the same thing as a body. It doesn't gradually grow or develop. It's an event, like birth and death. It only happens once in a person's entire existence. There is a point in a child's development, a unique moment after which she is alive and after which abortion is murder. I took a deep breath, preparing myself to phrase this right. Perhaps it would be best to just say it straight out, then face the objections as they came. Conception. The first unique moment. The start of a human life. Can anyone point to one other time in that child's existence that stands as such a bright line between life and not life? I turned, waiting. It took a moment, but they realized I was actually opening the floor to anyone who dared to take it. But it's only a single cell. I didn't see where in the crowd this objection came from, but it sounded like a boy's voice. Interesting. A single living cell. If a single living cell, a bacteria or amoeba or some such simple life form, were found on Mars or the moon, the scientific community would be crowing about life on other celestial bodies, life on other planets. Cellular respiration is taking place, DNA duplication and cell division. In short, the development of what we think of as the human body begins in that instant. Can something that is not alive accomplish that? I dared to glance at Candace, and when I saw her contemplative expression, no longer confrontational, but instead thoughtful, I began to wonder if it had actually happened. If I had convinced a person that at the very least their assumptions needed a second look and careful examination without having to use my big weapon. Well, just because it's alive doesn't mean it's a baby. The buzz of conversation that had been gradually growing as people muttered to their neighbors about the argument as it wound down ceased abruptly, and every eye turned towards Shara, who stood, red in the face from anger and embarrassment. There it was. The one statement I could never believe would come from a human mouth, but almost always did by the end. Someone would say it, or something along these lines, and whatever control I'd mustered, already sorely tested more often than not, would snap. I turned toward Shara slowly, and something in my bearing or expression caused her to take a step back. When I spoke, my voice had returned to the dangerous, icy calm with which I'd first interrupted her tirade. Then what, pray, is it? A human father? A human mother? Why should it not be a human child? What else can it be but a human baby? My tone went from icy calm to barely restrained inferno by the end, but I hadn't struck out physically yet. The twins moved up behind me, ready to intervene if I lost all control. Shara's mouth dropped open, completely shocked at my emotional response. Even Candace seemed taken aback. I didn't wait for an answer, but I pushed on. Shara, I swear, if the next thing you say is that the human fetus traces the evolutionary journey of its predecessors through embryonic development, or some other version of that nonsense. I caught my sister's eyes and changed veins. I am surprised that that load of baloney ever gained any footing in the academic community. A human never did conceive a fish or a monkey. A human infant never had gills. Is a child born at 5 or 6 months along caught unprepared halfway through its evolutionary flashback? For crying out loud, just think for once. Shara recovered her voice and temper both in an instant and took advantage of my pause for breath. Non-viable tissue. That's what all the doctors call it, non-viable tissue. Shara, I said in a voice frigid with rage, before I tell you to shut up, I have just one question. Do you ever actually think about what you believe? Or do you ever take to heart the popular motto of question everything? Or do you just blindly ingest and regurgitate whatever you are told by so-called experts, then turn around and criticize anyone religious for accepting what they believe on faith alone? That's more than one question, Candace observed dryly. Perhaps, instead of us insulting Shara, you should just go ahead and tell us why this means so much to you. I took several deep breaths, trying to get under control, but it was hard. I'd been fighting this for 17 years, and it always came down to this. Why did people need my story? Couldn't they see the logic of the truth without having to prod so far as to unearth the most painful side of it? I tried to give them both one last chance out. I didn't like using my closer. It felt like a blatant appeal to emotion. Do I need any other reason than trying to save a life? Don't you see? I believe the baby in the womb is alive from conception onward. Given what was already established that we both believe it is wrong to murder, is it any surprise that I will speak up for those who can't? Do I need any other reason? Candace's sarcasm turned to something approaching genuine concern. Maybe not a reason to speak up. I see where you're coming from there, but to get so angry. You've had personal experience with it, haven't you? You could say that, I admitted, my anger almost completely dissipated by her gentle question. I glanced at the twins and knew that I'd better say it all, rather than let the listeners speculate and fill in the gaps in their own mind. Some of you know me enough to know that I'm adopted. Some of you even know that I have medical issues stemming from being delivered extremely prematurely under traumatic circumstances. But most of you don't. I'm lucky. The cerebral palsy and epilepsy are relatively mild, especially when compared to what my brother James lived with. In the end, I lost my twin to the long-standing side effects of how he entered the world. He couldn't speak. He was quadriplegic, and he suffered daily seizures. But at no point was he ever simply non-viable tissue. Most of you never met him, but anyone who knew James can to this day talk about how alive he was. I saw the surprise dawn in Candace's face and knew she'd heard what I hadn't said. I fell silent as my throat closed, the way it always did when I thought about James. Shara, however, was not as perceptive as her friend. So, what's that got to do with anything? I mean, I'm sorry for your loss and all. Candace shook her head. Shara, just be quiet. She turned to me. You were aborted? I nodded as stunned silence fell. The attempt failed, obviously. Probably because they didn't know my mom was carrying twins. Nice to meet you. I'm the mistake the medical community refuses to acknowledge exists. That's all for this video. Thank you for your patience. Want to know some of the background information on this story or see the text version? In the description, I have the link to where it's posted on my DeviantArt profile, so head on over and read on. If you enjoyed it, please like, share, and subscribe, and please check out some of my other videos as well. Saw something I can improve on for next time, or something good you think I should keep doing? Let me know in the comments below. And thanks for listening to me ramble.